Hello. So I like to start talking about my work with kind of strange hybrid, some kind of birdie dog animal, and that's actually how I pretty much see my practice. So I employ lots of different media methods, but what I'm going to be talking to you today is about sort of this link between print, photography and drawing, and the kind of hybridity and how that brings sort of new meaning to an image. And really I'm going to talk about a 5-year process, which was my PhD, I'll say nightmare under the radar, but a really enjoyable process. But on a different level, you're now at a point where you're being asked to do a similar thing, which is to take your project proposal, to pull it apart, to question various aspects, and then bring it all back together. So although I'm talking about PhD here, the process is quite similar. So I'm really just talking about what I did, with a view to you thinking about how you might start to question your own practice in light of your project proposal. So I'll talk a little bit about the beginning, and we're all visual artists here, so I'm going to show you lots of images I'm going to try and explain stuff, but I like you to see what I'm talking about. Whoa, big. This is really early work of mine. This was on my MA donkeys years ago. And this was, I'm not going to talk about my practice as a whole. I'm going to talk about the things that led up to my research question, which I then interrogated. So I was really interested in drawing, always have been, always will be. But these are really early prints that I made, really simple dry point prints. So it was all about drawing and print language and the body. But on the right, this was my first attempt at starting to include a sense of something photographic within my work. I'm not a photographer. I never will be, because I'm not, of that mind. But I now like to use photography as a real integral point of my practice. So this was a really low res photocopy, which I then, it's part of a caravan, if you recognise it, one of those horrible cheap seats in a caravan. But I wanted the photograph to do something specific in the image. On the left you see there's kind of line drawing body figures. On the right, as soon as you see the photograph, you're taken somewhere else, and then you see the drawing. So I was really interested in that relationship between the photographic image and drawing for the first time. That difference in doing that to an image in a really simple way. So I made a whole body of work around these, but I'm pointing at a few things. This is a large digital print, and in the middle of the print, this shape that you see is actually a physical embossed print. It's like a photo etching, which has been printed onto the surface of a digital print. I was at the Royal Academy. I was invited to be a fellow there, and I was asked to set up a whole digital environment. And if you think about, this was my world before, so it was a whole new world I was being asked to be part of, digital. So for me, I thought, how can I use digital print? Never used it before, so I was taking really small sections of windows in slides. Now, you're all very young here, but old-fashioned slides made of kind of perspex or glass. And so I was looking at, there were probably or 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters, that kind of small, zooming in, blowing them up, and almost just using them as backgrounds for thinking about what to do within them. So the digital print, the photographic image, from a little scan of a tiny little slide, became a background or sort of an arena on which to do something else. So I was really interested, as soon as you took this digital print into a print room, I was printing on the surface with ink, with steel plate. It had pressure, so there's a sense of an emboss. What you don't get in a projection is the sense of surface quality. But if I can move the slide, is there a sense of the mouse? What you've got here, so this is the digital print. This here is the actual intaglio print. So it's physical, messy, oil-based ink over the top of very fine inkjet ink, but black on top of black. However, what interested me when I first started exploring it is I didn't know what would happen. I thought, I'm going to try it and see. But immediately, when you saw the image, although it was black on top of black, because one was a material ink black and one was a digital black, they didn't sit together. They actually sat apart. So immediately something changed in the image because I'd put this physical ink surface and embossed it on top of a digital ink surface. When I get to the end of my talk, you'll see that actually I go round in circles. And what I was interested in here was the digital print is actually, most of it is just dust, scratches. The mark that you see there, which is actually better here, but you can't quite see there, is a fingerprint mark, so it's that blown up. But it was something to work on, which quite excited me at the time, because, I wasn't a photographer. I then thought about expanding that, and I took a series of my own photographs, and I was superimposing them, so scanning them all in, layering them all up in Photoshop, and again, printing them out really big, so they're 2 meters by a meter, digital prints. And again, I thought, I want to do something on the surface. For me, at that point, digital wasn't enough. Again, I come from drawing, about printmaking, surface, intaglio, getting your hands dirty when you make something. So the whole idea of a pristine digital print was something that kind of scared me, and it wasn't enough for me. So what you see here is it's an inkjet print, which has then got a whole series of dry point prints printed over the top of its surface. So literally take the print, soak it in water, into the etching room, and print on the surface. And again, I was immediately struck by something which I couldn't predict, which I didn't think would happen, is I thought that they would all merge together, but what I was excited about, quite liked, was as soon as you put that ink line, as soon as it was printed on the digital surface, it was almost like a cobweb. You felt like you could pull it apart. And that for me was the kind of starting point in thinking as well about my work, what I'm going to do content-wise. I thought, actually, this is something which I'm not sure I know the answer as to why it's happening. So that was the first inkling of something I wanted to interrogate in a more deeper level. So these are details of the surface of that print. And you can see there that the plates I was using were free. They were from bus panels and caravan panels, recycling yards. But I was scratching in the surface, inking them up, and printing them over the digital. I was also interested in what happened here. So because I was scanning in lots and lots of photographs and layering them up on top of each other, blowing them up, zooming in, I was getting complete saturation and pixelization of the image. This is, 2001, I say, a long time ago. And at that point, everybody was interested in the highest resolution, the finest quality digital papers, the best printers. But actually, my head was actually thinking, I quite like the reverse. I quite like the fact that, you can superimpose images and they pull themselves apart. They break down. They became saturated. And then when this line is printed over the top, they kind of pull themselves apart. They might as well have been separate, but they were on the same surface, embossed, pushed into each other. So that really was the start of thinking about digital surface and hand-drawn, hand-inked line, and how somewhat, they didn't sit together. They just didn't. So I started to work again with photography. These are large digital prints. And I thought, rather than printing a line through etching or dry point, I began to think about just a normal pencil mark. So these are just drawing in metallic pencil over a black and white digital print. That's it. But the choices I made were that the digital print was on a really thick Somerset paper. So the surface was really velvety. And because of a metallic pencil, that meant there was a sort of grain to the surface of the paper, and the pencil mark really took quite nicely. But I was doing these in my studio, so large, just drawings on photographs. I was doing them up against the wall, and behind me in my studio, there's a whole row of windows. And again, it's not something I predicted, but the metallic pencil, when the light was in a certain way, would really shine out. I chose it because it was a certain grey, but what I didn't think about was when the light hit that metallic pencil, it would shine. So all these lighter areas that you see here, that's drawing, but it's the light is hitting it, so it absolutely shines. It's like a lens flare effect. So I made a whole series of these. I was drawing the photograph into itself. So if you look on the left, this is where we need a pointer. If I can find the mouse. Here we go. So this is the photograph here, and then this is me copying the photograph. So it's almost like when you've got two things joined together and they're sort of mirroring each other. And I did that more and more. I went over and over and over. And when the light shone on the actual image, it would completely come alive. The drawing would stand out of these kind of white, shiny marks. And there was this immediate sense of depth in the image that wasn't there before. So that was something that I started to think, okay, the drawing does something to the photograph. It must do, because it changes my perception of the depth of the image. So this is a detail. And I mean, for me, it looks like I could actually put my arm in there. But actually, alone, the photograph is quite flat. It's on a matte, thick paper. It's quite saturated, so it's not high contrast. But it was about what the drawing did. I then took that question in my head further. So again, these are large digital prints. But I thought, okay, if the pencil's grey, what happens if I make the digital photograph grey? So I took lots of photographs of fields, and these are rapeseed fields. In the computer, I deliberately took out all the colour, and then I took the black down to a mid-grey, and I got a pencil that was mid-grey, and I drew, this is a tiny little paper maquette, and I drew it onto the surface of the paper. So I wanted to see what would happen when the pencil grey is over the top of the inkjet grey. And as soon as I started drawing on it, it kind of sank back. So for me, the actual photograph looks like it's over the top, but it's not. The drawing was drawn over the top. So suddenly there was this, again, strange sense of ambiguity as where the depth of the photograph began and ended, and how it changed as soon as I put that drawing on it. So that was really the start of the journey for me to investigate exactly what was going on, looking at the photograph, looking at the drawing, and then how do they operate together when they're in the same picture. So I started a PhD with a very random question. You're all being asked to write a title for your project proposal. Come up with a title, we say. What are you going to start with? What's your question? Mine was really naff, really basic, but it was a starting point for me to then move on. So it was like, how do we, blah. I mean, it's the hardest thing for me, coming up with a title. So I thought, okay, how am I going to go about it? So there are methods, practice-based methods. So I knew that, one, I wanted to use my own work as a test bed to examine. Obviously, I'm an artist. I want to look for other artists and see if they did anything similar. I wanted to look at why suddenly digital print and digital photography allowed me to do this, when the thought of going into a dark room was something which, really wasn't interested in at all. And I thought, actually, I can do a whole series of experiments in this. So that's what was a multi-method approach. Doing your artwork, looking at other artists, that became case study research, examining artists' work, your own and others. Historical study, looking at how digital photography has changed the way that we make images, because for me, coming through fine art, coming through print, and drawing, digital suddenly allowed me to use it. I was like, hey, this is great, I can use this. But analog photography, I felt, was not really where it... So I thought, okay, let's look at the historical shift of photography and drawing. And then also, I was really interested in scanning found images all the time. So I thought, I'm going to actually make some experiments using scanner. That's what I thought, anyway, at the beginning. So I broke it down into different things. First of all, I looked at the photographic image. Remember that with my work, I pretty much now and for a lot of time always start with a photograph. So for me, it was about what did that mean for me? Why was it an important part of my work? So I went back and looked at Alberti's theory of this illusionistic window, because that's really what I was playing with. The photograph as something that you see through, into. So I looked at that idea of materiality, the analog, photomechanical and digital print. So in a way, that was my historical study, looking at that development. As I'm looking at that, I'm reading books about photography, about the idea of the photographic window. So Anne Friedberg wrote a book called The Virtual Window. And actually she said, hold on a minute, we've got here, if I go back, this is a painting. It was the window to the world. That was the term, looking out into the world. Suddenly, we've got Microsoft Office opening up a whole system called Windows. So we're allowed to look into the computer screen like we look out of the window. And then also the ideas that actually when we look at a photograph, we don't really see its surface, we look into it. So that was something that was really key for me. And also in that was around digital photography. And what it allowed me to do, it allowed me to work really quickly. And with the push of a button, I could actually produce a really big image in one go. Well, actually get someone else to push it, it's even easier. But it was kind of immediate. Immediately, I've got this big arena and I can play within it. That's what photography is for me. It's about editing out, because everything exists out there. You've just got to be selective of the bit that you want and don't want. So for me, that was about this digital window, looking into the computer, taking out information, cropping, editing, working quickly, and getting out a large kind of background image at that point. I started to look at photographers who kind of did the same in terms of make this big window to look into. And I thought, what is the image that you can get the greatest sense of illusionistic depth, where you look in and in and in and in, and it's infinite almost. So I found Hiroshi Sugimoto's seascapes, for me, were the images where you could go on to infinity. Look in. You don't look at the surface, unless they're projected. He's inviting you to look in for a long sense of time. Looking at horizon. You think about the notion of the horizon. It's a bad image, I apologise. The horizon is never attainable. You can never get to the horizon, because as you move, it moves. So I thought that was quite interesting. So I thought, aha, okay, instead of those field photographs, what if I try and use something similar? So, I mean, it was brilliant because my friend at the time, her dad lived in the Arctic Circle. So I said, when you go out there, can you take me some photographs? I don't mind if they're other people's photographs, that's fine. I acknowledge that. I use found images. So I thought, okay, the Arctic is white sky most of the time and white land. So that might be quite interesting. So I looked at photographs from the Arctic. I began using them. I made my own photographs. So I was using a glass box, perspex box, and using chalk and white backgrounds. I was taking out all the information. I was cropping the image. And then I also thought, what else? What other environment could I photograph or use where there's a kind of sense of visual ambiguity, the great depth? And at that time I was driving in the morning, and in the Midlands you get massive amount of fog. So I thought, great, fog is brilliant atmospheric condition where it prevents you from seeing clearly, so you immediately get this sense of depth. So I began looking at that in the work, producing images, photographing, scanning, getting things that I could create illusionistic depth. At the same time, I thought, okay, if photography with a camera captures space and depth, what happens when you capture an image with a flatbed scanner? Because I was scanning in lots of stuff, because flatbed scanning has no space, no depth, it's like a photocopy surface. So I thought, okay, let's try and do some experiments. So I took a photograph and I put it between two pieces of thin glass, and I made some little wedges out of bits of card, and I did a whole series of experiments where I gradually opened up the scanner bed and raised the photograph incrementally above the scanner bed. And I did it until I got to a point where I couldn't recognise the original photograph anymore. So the top left one was the original scan, on a flatbed scanner, scanned in. Then I raised it, and I did about 136 raises, to the point where, and I stopped where I thought, I'm going to stop when I can't recognise the photograph anymore, because you could go on and on. But I wanted a point to end in, and this was my end point. At this point, I thought, yes, this is the point where the focal point is just capturing it, blah, blah, blah. But what I didn't expect, and which was a real turning point, was the fact that, can you see all those white marks and specks and stuff all over it? I thought, what is that? I was going to swear then, but I'm not going to swear. The bloody hell is that? So annoying, I thought. How annoying to get all this stuff in my photograph. But then I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? Because if you do open up a scanner or a flatbed device or something which is laid out open for a long period of time, that's what happens. Well, that's what happens in my flat anyway. I don't know about anyone else. You might live in a really clean laboratory. But I started to think, my God, okay, so anything flat that's left open that's kind of capturing something is inevitably going to capture this stuff, which is dust. And then I began to think, okay, so if that's a photograph and dust, what am I looking at? And why is it there, and why am I interested in it, most of all? I began to look at the same... Remember, this is all a juggling act, and we're asking you to juggle. I'm not doing one after the other most of the time. I'm actually looking at all these things together. So I started to think about what other processes of making artworks are where the orientation is like a scanner, flat, horizontal, on the floor, on the tabletop. This is Helen Chadwick making pieces where she was looking down, collecting samples on a microscope. So I thought, okay, where else do you look down to make? So I looked back to really early photography, which was the photogram, images on a flat surface being exposed. And there was something saying, actually, well, this is really not the same as standing with a camera, because in the photogram process, you're actually capturing the weight of something as it sits, gravity, the weight on the surface of the photographic paper. Yes, there's transparency in that, but essentially these have to be objects which will sit heavily on something in order to capture an image. I've looked at Helen Chadwick. She made a whole series using photocopiers. So simple, but they're photographic prints. But if you were trying to do that and have all these objects in a normal orientation, stood upright, etc., you wouldn't get the same image. That image is like it is because it's about weight and gravity. Her body and that sheep, bizarrely enough, the reason why they're that shape, they're that colour, is because the weight of the body is pressed on the photocopier. So again, I thought, actually, this is really interesting. It's about weight and gravity as much as anything else. I looked, who else uses photocopier to make work, and why do they use it? Giuseppe Pannoni was somebody who's interested in the body materiality, and so he used the photocopier to literally photocopy all around his skin. So he talked about a kind of journey around his skin, pressing against the photocopier. Ian Byrne was sort of conceptual art and language artist, and this is a whole book which is about taking a piece of blank paper through a photocopier. So to begin with, it's blank, and as you open the book and work through the pages, you end up with a whole image which is full of just scratches, dust, toner, interference. So again, that's about, well, there's something about orientation, materiality, the weight of things dropping. Obviously my background is print, and I thought, well, the aquatint is exactly the same. Aquatint is resin, dust. You put the plate in, you rev up the dust falls onto the plate, and then you use it to create noise in the image. And Goya did that really, really well. He used aquatint dust to create something within the image. Toba Kadori, painting, drawing, but you can't really see it on this slide because it's super, super subtle. But she makes drawings, then covers the surface of the drawings on paper with wax and just leaves them out in the open in her studio. So when you actually see the surface in detail, it's covered in crap. It's debris, it's hairs, it's anything that's falling on the surface gets embedded in that image. So it's part of the materiality. It wouldn't happen if it was upright drying or in a cupboard drying. It's because it's out, lying flat in the world. And I thought, for me, that was really interesting. And really interesting because it was part of the making of the image. It did something to the image. So I began to think, what about photography? What happens if this is interrupting the image? What happens when you get something like that on a photograph? What does it do? And I looked to Gerhard Richter's series called Overpainted Photographs. You might know him more as a painter, but there's a whole series where he's using little snapshots, leaving them around in his studio and flicking paint on them, whether you believe it was incidental or not, deliberate. And then the sort of writing around that, when you're looking at the work, inevitably you're reading what people are saying. And the interesting thing for me was this idea of breaking the spell. And I thought, that's really interesting. This spell, what is this spell? And actually that is the bit where you see a photograph and you look in it and you kind of believe in it as a window. And then suddenly you've got this blob of paint that says, this isn't an illusion, this isn't real, this is a surface, it's a piece of paper. So there was suddenly the breaking of this whole thing around what the photographic image is. Miroslav Tichy, contemporary photographer, but making the camera box out of card, inevitably there was light came in, dust came in, things were made, handmade, and all the images, you know, you could see the photograph, but there's all this interference within it as well. And Daido Moriyama was someone who I thought was really exciting, a Japanese photographer. And again, a lot of the photographs, there's a whole series called Farewell Photography or Bye-Bye Photography, where everything is actually made badly. So as a photographer, you probably go, it's awful, it's blurry, you can't see it, there's dust everywhere, lights coming in. But I thought, actually, no, it's just a different way of thinking about how we look at photographs. And also, I was interested in Robert Rauschenberg. You probably know of Robert Rauschenberg, and you might know these transfer drawings. So they're photographs which have been covered in solvent, which have then been pushed through, so the photograph becomes transferred onto the paper. But as it's pushed through with a pencil, you don't get the whole photograph. So I was interested in how these kind of flicker in and out of space. So you get a sense of illusion, but you don't. And that's what Rauschenberg was interested in. So having looked at all that, gone, who else? Isn't that interesting? Suddenly, I've got key artists that I can say, these are really relevant for me and my research. They're helping me answer my own questions. So this was my kind of case study research. At the same time, obviously I wasn't just looking at everybody else's work. I was wanting to make my own work, to question the same things. So I took those photographs of the Arctic, of fog, I printed them out, And then I thought, okay, what if I use the dust and draw the dust onto my photographs? So this is a piece of glass that I left out, allowed it to collect dust, I scanned it in, and then I drew the dust, particles of dust, over the photographic prints. So I'm kind of artificially creating something that I'd already seen before, but I was looking at how you saw the Arctic photograph, and then as soon as you started drawing on it, you are creating a whole new sense of surface. So I showed work, I asked people to look at the work and answer questions. Can you see the drawing and the photograph at the same time? How does your eye look at the image? This is probably the worst image to try and project on a very light projector, by the way, so it's a bit darker than this. But you can get a sense of, so I sat literally on the floor drawing particles of dust with a pencil on the photographic surface. So I'm trying to show you detail. It's the hardest thing to photograph. This is probably the best bit. So the whole thing was eventually covered, but the photograph was underneath. And at that point I started to gauge these. Actually, they're very different. They're very different in their sense of distance, optical distance. Drawing, I was actually sat there about that far away from the print, making the drawing. The photograph, I was on the computer pressing a button. I'd never touched the surface, so suddenly the idea of touch became interesting for me. Temporality, I could make the photographic print actually quite quickly, and when I was drawing it took weeks, so I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. I became obsessed by drawing dust for weeks on end. And the idea of materiality, and that was something that really early on, why was I wanting to work over photographs? For me, that was because I wanted to actually do something physical as an artist, make something. So I questioned these things. One, the optical, the photographic, the digital, and the other thing, the drawing, actually making a mark on the surface of something. And I thought that idea of touch was really interesting, and I thought, where is that notion of touch? And I found this quote by Derrida, and saying actually how we use the word touch, when I say our eyes touched across the room. Really? How? Where? At what point? But for me, the idea of contact was important. So I started to investigate the notion of literal touch, tactile touch. How do I touch my digital photograph when it's in the computer? You can't. You can work on it, but it's held in the screen, away from my hand. So the digital photograph cannot get dust. It doesn't get dusty. It has no weight because it's data. So all those things, I thought, oh, God, yeah, actually it really makes sense now. And those were the things for me that were missing. But those were the things for me that I wanted to use it for. And I think for me, as someone interested in print, that the digital was vital for allowing me to do that. So I looked at digital print and the history of printmaking, where digital came in and how it shifted people making work, because it shifted my work in every way. But also important was this idea of touch. And Henry Fosselon, or however you want to pronounce it, wrote some really nice things around the artist and touch and the maker. And how when we pick up a piece of paper, we don't just pick it up, we feel it, we can feel it moving, we feel its weight, we feel its surface. And that really resonated with something. And I take that right back to all my early work, where I'm drawing, where I'm using print and using ink. And then I looked again at Pannoni and thought, actually, there's a whole series where he uses his own fingerprint to begin the artwork. So in the middle is his fingerprint. Then he takes a pencil and he draws round and round and round his own fingerprint. So that idea of touch became really important. And I thought, actually, this is me lifting up a piece of glass to then put on a tabletop to collect dust. So inevitably, things that I touch have my own fingerprint on. They have my own marks. So I thought, actually, this is how I can touch my digital image, by making greasy marks on the surface of my monitor. And if you've got a laptop or an iPhone, there'll come a point where you just go, oh my God, I can't see anything because the surface is so greasy, or there's fingerprints everywhere. Or if you look at your iPad, turn it off, catch it in the light, and you can see all the points where you touch and drag the screen. That's how you touch a digital image for me. So I thought that was quite interesting. But the pencil did something different. That created the shift. That was something which created something completely contradictory. And that's why I think I liked it, because it was something physical on the surface. So again, we've got the on the surface into the image, into the screen. So I took my black and white, seemingly black and white, digital prints with drawing, and I put them under a microscope. And this is what I got. So this is just one of these, if I can zoom back, forgive me, to that. This is a close-up of one of those digital prints with drawing. So zoom back again. So that is the pencil that looks like gold ingot. I thought, yes, that's why I like drawing, because it's stuff, it's physical, and that's why I like the digital print, but it's not enough because it's this very flat surface. And that reminded me of Duchamp and the dust breeding, and the idea of the surface of the artwork gathering dust, gathering materiality of the world. So at that point I was having a whale of a time collecting dust in my flat, collecting hairballs, anything that fell on a piece of glass. I scanned it in, blew it up, and then I drew it over the surface. So they're digital prints of Arctic scenes, fog, etc. Printed them out, put them on the floor, and I sit there and just draw and trace dust, hairballs, and any other thing that's going to fall on. Mostly probably cat hair, because I have a pet. But what I was fascinated by was how we look at this image that employs two very contradictory things. How we look at the drawing and then we look at the photograph. How we can't really put into focus the two things together. So these, I made loads of them, I was obsessed by them. And at the same time reading and saying, okay, who's looking at these ideas of the photographic picture plane? So I began to build a bibliography that was relevant for me, that helped support my thinking about this optical and physical split and materiality. So all these things for me were around this idea of the photographic. Then I began to look at this drawing, the drawing from the body, the sense of touch, of being in the world. And I looked at Aristotle, Merleau-Ponty, philosophers that were really engaged in actually we need to touch the world, we need to engage in something material. And that really resonated with me. So I looked to philosophy. I've never been there before, but actually it supported my thinking. I wasn't a philosopher, but they were really useful because they kind of went, yes, what you say has some meaning. So I thought, great, thank God for that. Then I looked to the world of print because that was my context. And people who were in printmaking arena and thinking about print research and the notion of digital print and how that shifts the way that we make artwork. So really, at that point, I'd made a whole body of work. I made a whole body of experiments. I had a whole bibliography, which were critical thinkers around photography, people thinking around drawing, what happened when they came together, and the context for my work. So really, that was my project. That was my PhD. Well, 5 years into 45 minutes, which is quite hard to do, so I've obviously chopped out a hell of a lot. But really that came together to say, actually, all these things together were a big journey of investigation, of reading, thinking, making, and that's what we're asking you to do right now, is to think, to read, to make, to question, then to read, think and make again, and then again and again. So it's an ongoing process. Making something, questioning it, making something again, questioning that. So it's like a snowball effect. So really I came up with this kind of conclusion to why these things operate in certain ways. And actually for me, it was great because it validated why I make work in certain ways. So after that, kind of coming closer to what I'm doing now, this was recent work. This was work in progress. So I thought about the notion of dust and drawing and landscape as a space. But I thought, actually, without the PhD, I turned everything on its head. I thought, what if instead of drawing bits of dust in pencil on the photograph, what if I almost covered the entire photograph in pencil and left little bits of the digital print? So I kind of did the reverse. So these were large digital prints, 2 meters by a meter. And there you can see I'm sat on the floor. And I covered the entire surface with just a bog standard graphite pencil. And it took a long time. But again, I had a thought of doing it. I thought I knew what might happen, but I really didn't get what would happen until it happened. And again, I was interested in this idea of this kind of collision between this graphite surface, this very physical, tactile surface. So these are just some details, which inevitably shifted and changed. If you've worked in pencil, again, the light hits it, it's got a shimmer, so the light would change the image. So incredibly hard to photograph because from different angles it always looks completely different. But I like the fact that it was the reverse. Most of the image was pencil and underneath was the digital print, and then I just left pockets of digital print. So it was like they were punctuated. I'm really excited by those, but they took so long and I had a really bad finger afterwards trying to hold that bloody pencil. So that's something I'm still interested in. And then I thought about actually the dust that I'd used was, you could see that dust. It's the dust that you can see on a screen. So I approached the Natural History Museum and I am currently working with scientists. I'm actually gathering dust and scanning it into an electron microscope and then blowing that up. And again, I'm interested in the role of technology and how I can see things. Obviously we've got the invisible, see things that the naked eye can't. The electron microscope goes in and in and in. What you see there is dust on the surface of dust, believe it or not, which is pretty mind-boggling. So this is a tiny, tiny particle of carborundum. So again, that's kind of dust particles on the surface of a particle that you cannot see. So this is carborundum. But that was only part of it. I was really excited by that, but I thought, okay, well, that's the technological image. So what happens if I take this minute thing that's kind of gathered through technology, most recent high-tech technology, and then I make a drawing of it? So I took the photograph and then I spent ages, again, slowing the image right down, renegotiating it through the act of drawing. I thought, actually, that's really, for me, that was really interesting because it was about time, it was about materiality, and it was about how we sort of perceived the world through modern technology as opposed to actually just through the naked eye or kind of embodied seeing, etc. So I began at that point to make a whole series. So I was scanning in, putting in the microscope graphite powder, and I made a drawing of a tiny graphite particle. So I quite like this because I didn't think of it at the time, but I thought actually it's really interesting because it's graphite and it's drawn in graphite. So it's kind of a mind-boggling. But it threw up new things around how we see this in terms of scale. And also at that time I was going into the Interplanetary Sciences Archive. So I was looking out into space at dust as well as looking down at particles of dust and then pulling them together. So this is kind of stuff that I'm also doing now. But at that time I was using random particles of dust, graphite, carborundum. I was going into the archives saying, actually, this could be a mountaintop. It could be a boulder. How do we know how big this thing exists? actually this tiny bit of dust is this. It's just more of it clumped together. So I quite like that idea of perception, of scale, of turning things on their head and saying, this is the same as this. It looks the same, it is the same, but actually it's perceived in very different ways. Here we're looking out up into space, one we're looking down. At the same time, I made a whole series of stone lithographs which were really small, and I'm still making these. So these just about this big, drawing onto stone surface and print and making the drawing through the actual stone itself. And again, I quite like that. It's super slow. The most traditional of processes, stone lithography, time consuming. But I like the speed that this is an image that emerges super quick from technology, and then I slow it right down when I represent it. So this is now more recent. So I'm interested in dust. I'm interested in now kind of what it means to perceive it, what it's made of, how actually I've been thinking that it is an archive of everything. And part of my background, my history is I'm also interested in place and a sense of time and place. So I went to, this was in April, I went back to my father's and grandmother's home right in the middle of Hamburg, which was heavily bombed throughout World War II, but their building stood. My grandmother was in the building and came often back and forth through World War II. Everything was devastated, but in the attic and the cellar, everything remained the same. The windows blew out, but even now it's hardly touched. So I went there and I gathered the dust that was in the attic and gathered all the dust from the corners with little brushes and pockets in the cellar. And I'm scanning that in now and drawing that as I guess a kind of, what I'm interested in is it as the dust as an archive of showing us actually what is around us, that we can go to a museum and see an archive and collections of objects, but actually the stuff that's around us is the stuff that we've actually been through. It evidences history, it evidences people, it evidences place. So I'm thinking now, what also is in this dust, I've started to look at it, it's ongoing, but there's pollen grains in there. There's all sorts of stuff. I did find a dead dust mite, which was pretty weird. But I'm kind of interested in all this stuff is around us. And now I'm thinking of ways to negotiate that. So I'm thinking about how I'm interested in these dialogues between materiality and the photographic, how you can reference place through photography. So these dust particles, they exist, they have a weight. So could I make a drawing and actually sculpt it into something like one of those dust particles? So this is one of those large graphite drawings. One side is graphite, the other side is digital print, and then I've ran it through the press and I've folded it and sculpted it using one of those graphite microscope pictures to kind of work with. So I'm interested in that, giving the actual image weight and gravity. And I like the fact that when you look at these things, you're left with something incomplete. You can't complete this. You can see a bit of the photograph, you can see a bit of the drawing, but you're left in this kind of world of ambiguity. And at the same time, I'm making, these are quite small drawings, referencing the attic. So I'm drawing the beams of the attic and then redrawing in very different way these kind of little particles of dust. This is very much in process. Kind of look and go, ooh, I need to make some different decisions. But these are the things that I'm thinking now, how am I taking that further, making new questions, thinking about dust in different ways, but drawing, history, memory, and this notion of archive, which I think is coming in, which is quite interesting. So, yeah, and that's the end of my journey and talk. So that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Gosh, don't all speak at once.
I just wanted to ask about the process you used to make the images of the dust.
Which ones?
So the first ones you showed, was it the drawn lines, which seemed to be something that maybe you could do at home or something like that, opposed to the, obviously you've got the very...
These ones? So
no, the sort of magnified images of
the electron microscope ones?
Yeah, so it's later that.
These ones?
Yeah, obviously that's sort of a process
Yeah.
that you had to go somewhere else to do, but you also showed some sort of, is it lines of drawn graphite, sort of ultra close up?
Yeah, they were using a microscope. These ones.
Yeah.
So that was using a microscope.
Okay. Just
So,
a sort of microscope.
Well, it was actually from the MA conservation course that we've got here. I went in and used their microscopes where they've got a camera attached to a microscope. But it wasn't a very high res, high powerful magnification on these at all. So, but I mean, when we're going in these ones which are closer, yeah, they're beyond anything probably that a scanner could do. Yeah. However, Amazon, you can get really quite cheap little adapters with heads on that can go quite close.
Okay.
About £20. Quite handy. Hello.
Hi. You've been pretty consistent in your research, like for a long time. Like you
Yeah.
knew that was interest you, and you stuck with it for a very long period of time. Has it ever happened that you kind of got distracted by other things and perhaps took another way and then gone back to your initial thought? And
Yeah, but that was part. So yeah, absolutely. And I had moments where I absolutely didn't know what the hell I was doing. Absolutely. There was the kind of breakthrough moments, but it was perseverance. And even the bits where I made stuff and it was really bad, it answered questions. So, and again, I think that's why for you guys, it is a journey where you'll go down blind alleys, dead ends, but they'll answer a question in doing that. But yeah, oh God, it was like this. If I could draw a diagram of the whole thing, there'd be lots of down points. It's tough because you're being asked to question something. And sometimes to question it, you have to make mistakes and errors and go off somewhere else. But if it was perseverance, I mean, I did that part-time. I was working 3 days a week. So I had 2 days a week to do the whole thing in. So it was kind of, I had a head for life, I had a head for paid work, and then a head for this stuff. So it is a juggling act. But hopefully you're all passionate enough and you're in. And, art is something I think that's within us that we don't stop. So it was never, even when I would go away or sitting on a bus, or it was just a constant reading or looking or researching. So just a drip, slow drip. But yeah, lots of dead ends, lots of bad things. But they're part of it. Yeah, it looks great when you put a PowerPoint together.
Yeah.
You pick all the good bits.
Could we see the research question again?
Pardon?
Could we see the research question again?
The early one. I mean, it was clunky. It was just a kind of something that was... Yeah, so in the end it was completely different. It was about how we viewed contradictions within the photographic image through dust. So the whole thing, at the beginning it wasn't about dust at all, but the whole of the thesis at the end, was all about that the dust could do what I was questioning. So I used it as subject matter, and now it's become, in a way, content of my work as well as subject matter, because generally, fascinated that it can evoke so many things, kind of metaphors, and talk about so many things. But to begin with, it was almost just like, what can I draw on the surface? And I thought, actually, if I draw dust, it is everything. So when I go back and show you that again, that's when I say, oh my God, I'm doing the same things over and over again. I'm interested in fingerprints and dust. But I think actually we generally are interested in things, so we will come back to them.
Nice. Well, the dust that I was just thinking, because obviously you're talking about drawing. I'm just interested in this thing where you're drawing the dust.
Yeah.
And when you're saying about collecting it onto glass, and that's sort of like that. Examining that thing that you look through the flatbed scanner and this idea of things collecting over time. But then I know because that early question is about looking at drawing in the digital sort of photographic image and something being on top of the other one. I was just wondering about whether the dust, or like whether you did things where the dust then is actually directly on the work, or because your drawn line is then always representing a very organic thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then again, doing the very detailed drawing of the other one, where that's again.
Yeah.
I was just sort of interested in that and what the thoughts were.
What, whether I would just homogenise it? And
Well, I suppose like when you showed the image, which artist was it who'd done the paint drops were on the work where that's that material being directly onto it instead of something where you're more intentionally copying something that's quite a skilled act, where you're like, even though it's something that's quite a loose mark, it's a very natural occurrence with the dust. And I suppose as well, like just questioning like how did you have just these sheets of glass with dust on them, and then you were
scanning them in, blowing them up as a print, and then just literally copying them.
And you'd have that next to the photographic image.
But then after a while, I didn't need to copy. I just had this whole. I knew if you wanted me to draw a long hair that was, 10 centimetres, I could draw it.
Yeah.
A curly one, a straight one, a
so
particle.
Like
It's like having a toolbox.
Yeah.
And I would let the photograph just dictate how I covered the so I began literally copying, and then I started to just become the dust and just spread myself over.
Yeah, I guess I was sort of interested in that idea of like your action in that and your role in that, and where that's obviously to draw is to do something very deliberate.
Yeah.
But then if you're like adopting things through like that visual language, which then makes you more
fluid.
to draw in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, the early ones, the sort of copying and tracing was really rigid. If I can find them. So these ones, so these ones, I'm literally going, how do I draw that, and kind of sculpting it. But in the end, these were more where I'd just sort of adopt it.
And with these in like real life, do they, like you were saying with the material of the pencil, like the graphite and the shyness, does it look like, because on this it looks, a lot like, it's kind of hard to think that that's not dust, or like how, I'm just wondering how close they are in real life.
No, I would be drawing something, and then sometimes I'd do that. Because I said, bloody hell, and I go, oh shit, no, that's a drawing.
That's good.
You mentioned philosophy hiding and the question concerning technology. And that idea of like that dark rabbit thing, like you see one thing then the other thing, and your eye flicks between the two. Can you say a bit more about what Heidegger mentioned in relation to that?
Well, for that, I was looking at how he talked about matter and technology and how things come into being. So it's kind of bringing forth of the image through technology, more than that kind of that bit, illusion. So that was more around, that point when technology changed, or we made tools, and we would see, or so, for example, he talked about when we saw a vase, we would see its function before its matter. and how it's made before the, you know, so that was, so in terms of Heidegger was looking very specifically at a couple of essays which were around that, and more around the role of technology and matter, and how you bring forth an image from technology, how it emerges from making.
Did he have any like moral stuff in that, like to do with being with how we are related to that, or potentially alienated, or any kind of moral stuff around that?
Well, I mean, I think he saw a detachment from that, from the hand and from technology. Have you read Heidegger? Are you interested in that?
Yeah, ages ago, so that's why I was quite
Yeah.
interested in
Phenomenology.
and how that it's quite interesting to me. So
Yeah.
There's a couple of slides I wouldn't mind seeing again. We have one on Giuseppe and the blue photocopy of a woman in the sheet.
Yeah. So Helen Chadwick.
Oh yes, Helen.
I remember Jonathan's recording this. If you and the Pannoni one,
That's it.
Giuseppe Pannoni. Yeah. Jill.
Yes, I was just thinking that dust as a subject is absolutely enormous.
Yeah.
And one of the many things that's incredibly impressive about the work is that you weren't sort of sidetracked into, you know, the fact that we all turn into dust.
Oh, I was. And that goes back to your.
You know, I mean, there are just so many things that you could
Yeah.
have done with dust,
Yeah.
and you've sort of drawn out very little about dust, which is incredibly clever. And I just wondered about the sidetracking, you know, the sort of intellectual sidetracking in a way, rather than the physical drawings. How that.
Yeah, I mean, I read all about it. Inevitably, you have to. What is it, where it's come from, what it's made of, all the people that use dust. I mean, what you see here is a tiny snippet of the stuff I've looked at, of the artists I researched, the things I read. But to combine, you know, for a PhD, you write, you know, there's a 30,000 word thesis, which has everything in it, but essentially writing 100,000 words. And so I did read all about it, but then, like when you do your research paper, you have to pull yourself back and just say, and even, you know, going back to Heidegger and reading around philosophy, you have to pull yourself back and say, yeah, I could really go into this, but what aspect of it is relevant for my questioning? What am I going to use? But in my thesis, I did, you know, the latter end of it, I was talking about kind of metaphors and the ruin. And at the time I was teaching photography, and, you know, there is that sense of and that breaking spell, but the ruin and the dust being a kind of ruin of the image. And so, it was all in there, believe me. Yeah. Okay. Obviously, I know a lot of you in the room, so ask me, or if you see me, you're welcome to come and ask me or email me any questions that you might have later. Please feel free. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.